Having spent the last 7 weeks or so talking about how you should do methods, I am going to end, I think appropriately, by arguing that anything goes. This is the argument that appears in Paul Feyerabend's book Against Method. He argues that the methodological enterprise of the scientific method is rotten at its core. As a result, in the 1980s, a very famous article in Nature, which is the preeminent journal for science, argued that he was the greatest enemy of science. He got that kind of title. So who is this guy, and why is he making this argument? First, let me expand beyond that short of the very shortest version of his argument is anything goes. That he's arguing for a kind of epistemic, at least a kind of epistemic anarchism. He wants to make he opens his book by making a distinction between political anarchism, which he doesn't think works. Leave that aside for a second, but for a kind of epistemic anarchism, a view that we should do away with rigid rules about the methods by which we engage in science. So why does he think we should do that? He goes back and looks historically at a few examples of how science has happened. I'll talk a little bit about where he's coming from in a minute, but I'll say that he's at this point, I think, one of the core of a group of people you might talk about as being part of the philosophy of science. If you took a program in philosophy of science, you'd almost certainly have to read Against Method. And so his argument is, looking historically, you can see lots of examples of scientific breakthroughs. In fact, he managed to witness some of these. But he starts with Galileo and goes through a number of other examples where he argues that despite the myths we tell ourselves about how science actually happens, in fact, our greatest scientific discoveries are tied up in processes that are very different from those kinds of rational and rational processes that we might see in something like the hypothetico-deductive model. That they are reliant on a whole bunch of stuff outside of what we might see in what we might normally call science. So the scientific method is in a number of different varieties. It is following a rational set of empirical investigations to help to falsify a hypothesis and then reformulate that hypothesis and then test that iteratively. This is kind of a Popperian version, right? And he argues that that's just not how real science tends to work, that it tends to do things like engage in ad hoc hypotheses that are not finding a hole in the literature or testing a falsifiable claim. He suggests that often people engage in metaphorical thinking, make leaps that are based on personal history or accident. They may follow a method, but often that the kinds of thinking, theoretical breakthroughs are based in often methodological breakthroughs, where they've been doing things, in the case of someone like Galileo, kind of naively assuming that reflections in a glass work in a particular way. And it's because they've been working with their hands on grinding glass, right? A lot of these are not really and maybe it's unfair to use Galileo at a very proto-scientific stage, but he kind of goes through and looks at other examples of this as well, where, the actual breakthroughs, the stories that we tell about them are not necessarily accurate to what happened. And we are often trying to fix them into this frame of how we think science should work. And it doesn't really work that way. So this anything goes approach suggests that we shouldn't let those rigid rules kind of constrain inquiry, that people should engage in inquiry that interests them. Just because it's not coming out of the literature, not coming out of a large overarching scientific paradigm, doesn't mean it's not worth investigating. People should go their own way. You should allow for multiple, even conflicting approaches to coexist. They should be in conversation with each other. They should, when we have violations of methodological norms, this should be seen as potentially productive, not as something that should be excluded from the literature or excluded from conversation. I don't know if we want to necessarily encourage purposeful bomb throwing and purposeful violations of methodological norms, but he says that's not in itself not a problem. I will bracket off here and say that let's make clear there's a difference between violating methodological norms and violating ethical expectations. I would say that in many cases, following ethical norms is more following methodological norms is more ethically fraught than engaging in a violation of those norms. So I do think we need to separate out, norms or expectations around ethics and norms or expectations around methods. And we should talk a little bit about, in this course, we'll be talking about methods chiefly as kind of the nuts and bolts about how you do something, right? You can take an entire course on how to construct a survey, or you can and a lot of that course will be about how you fall back on how others have constructed that survey. It's not an accident that we fall back on Likert scales, even if we have good evidence that they might not be the best way to measure things. So we tend to fall into the ruts, the patterns that have been established methodologically, without criticizing them. We also tend to accept that our ethical, certainly after a period in which we engaged in pretty unethical kinds of investigations, that we have an ethical code, and as long as we're hitting that minimum bar, we're fine. So in both of these cases, we are probably being constrained in pretty negative ways by the existing practices. And his argument is that we should abandon those, that we should engage in practices that violate expectations around methodological purity. That, to the extreme end of this, that we should engage in what he calls counterinduction. That is, every time you're making an inductive claim, this is kind of the opposite. Falsifiability is an interesting piece, right? Like, so falsifiability is can we disprove the negative, right? This is how you end up with a null hypothesis. But for Feyerabend, he's saying that we should actually engage in induction. We should say, here's a jump. Well, what if we jumped in the other direction? What if we made a claim that is contrary to, even if it's contrary to the evidence we've seen? Why don't we, this is kind of the devil's advocate of a theory. Can we come up with a theory that is sort of the opposite, or, it's not a binary, but some set of opposing counter theories or counter approaches or counter hypotheses that are not what we would immediately jump to as an inductive process. So it is this kind of question of, can we make sure that we are not tracking along a track that gets us going in a direction and blinds us to other possibilities. So it's not just accepting multiple approaches and multiple models and multiple ways of thinking about a problem. It is actively encouraging those in some sense. Why would we engage in this kind of epistemic sabotage? Why are we trying to mess with the scientists? And his argument is that basically that these theories are that our process of observation. One of the things we're trying to do with method is, in many cases at least, is to remove ourselves from the observational process, right? That's not true of ethnography. That's not true of some of the more humanistic approaches. But generally in the social sciences, our aim is to get rid of what may be, our personal biases, right? This is to aid reliability. That is, the point is that anybody who looked at these same data should be able to find the same findings we do. That's the view of reliability. And so we want to try to engage in methods that get rid of our own preconceptions. And for Feyerabend, he's like, well, you can't do that. And we already know that. We're trying to mitigate against it. But B, that it's not just the people that are biased, but the theories. That you see everything through a theory-colored lens. And so this is the problem, is that you tend to kind of track along that paradigm. And when you observe something, what you've read, what you've understood to be the world, you're going to see it through that. And sometimes this can be, I would say, almost totalizing, right? There are people who are evolutionary psychologists who see everything through the lens of evolutionary psychology. There's a whole problem with evolutionary psychology, which is that it's non-falsifiable. Not to use the language that this is not Feyerabend. This is very much, you can always, it's a just so story that says, well, then it must be, we can explain it through a story that is evolutionary. You can always find an evolutionary explanation for why people do a certain thing. And so that makes it not very useful, because it can always be that, and you can never disprove that it does have an evolutionary root. And evolutionary processes are such a core element of of how humans are built and how we interact socially, that there probably is an evolutionary explanation for everything. But because of that totalizing view, once you get accepted into the church of evolutionary psychology or evolutionary sociology, you're kind of stuck there. You can't, every time you see something, you're going to be thinking, what processes of evolution led to this, right? Basically, he uses the example that once you have a view of the way the universe works, you look at the sky differently, right? Your ability to observe the sky is shaped by that theoretical process. So part of the reason for throwing these kind of methodological bombs is to try to whack you on the side of the head to say, wait, what if let's take seriously the Earth being the center of the universe. If we take that as the not just temporarily, not as a null hypothesis, but if we take that on seriously, what can we run with that? And can we find things that are true despite having accepted a false premise? Does this allow us to engage in kinds of experimentation that discover something even though we didn't have a full understanding of the context in which we were looking? And he gives a number of examples of that messiness where people are assuming something about a situation and then go, oh wait, what? stuff goes through this slot and and it doesn't get randomly deposited on the other side when it's a light. Oh, wait, these kinds of processes, or thinking through stories like what if the entire universe is built out of little magnets on swivels? Like, what would this is like, that's a ridiculous story. Of course the world isn't made up of little pulled magnets on widgets. But once you tell that story, you end up finding, that light's a wave and a particle, and you do all kinds of really interesting things by considering a world in which that's the case. And so he suggests that not only do we throw bombs like this, but that we start to accept that things like rhetoric, argumentation, metaphor, even propaganda can be an effective piece of what we should be doing in science. I could do a little bit here on kind of the history of propaganda. Propaganda, the term, comes from propagating the faith. It comes out of the Roman Catholic Church. But certainly during the early part of the 20th century, we have this landmark book called On Propaganda from Edward Bernays. And in that case, he's using propaganda equally for marketing and for political propaganda. Now, when we say propaganda, we're usually talking about state-driven political propaganda. This is opposed to disinformation, which might be engaged at from the grassroots. And when we talk about marketing, we're often talking about business propaganda. So that division has happened. But he's suggesting that, it's not just a matter of, rational speech or purely scientific work, or purely scientific kinds of talk that lead to an understanding of the world, but rather the play between the way people talk about things and the way they argue through things and the way they explain things. Ironically, this will get us to some of the people that Feyerabend kind of knew and his intellectual development was based on. So he comes out of as I said, he had one foot in the philosophy of science and one foot in physics. He's a quantum physicist, and he made some fairly important discoveries in quantum physics. And he hung out with a bunch of really interesting people, people like Niels Bohr, people like Kuhn, people like Popper, and people like Wittgenstein, who kind of early Wittgenstein talked about this idea of building a language that is logical, that is, can you understand language as being a rational process? And then, you have this division between that and late Wittgenstein, where he talks more about this language as a game, as a process of a not a rules-based process, but rather a process in which rules emerge through interaction. And so it's interesting. I don't know that I'm sure someone has made that connection, given that Feyerabend actually knew and worked with Wittgenstein as well. But he comes out of this he comes out of Austria and Germany through the war, and he's hanging out with these people, and he is raised very much in what would later be called the logical positivist mode of scientific inquiry. And he knows these people like Popper and like Kuhn, the people that will kind of shape this view of a rational process of science as a kind of institutional, rational, rules-based approach. And some of his early work is written in that. And as he argues later, he said it had to be written in that because he never would have been successful as a scientist or as a philosopher in that context had he not kind of endorsed the party line when it comes to this stuff. He came to be the kind of director of a famous set of symposia that was held each year at Altbach. There's a callback here. I was actually invited to speak at that. And this is where I pretended to be the mayor of a small hotel in Altbach, even after I left. So he kind of ran this symposium in Altbach and was a professor at Vienna and then at Bristol. And then at the end of the 1960s, he shows up at Berkeley and he got woke. He's there right at the peak of the free speech movement, and it is kind of like this is Saul in the desert kind of an epiphany for him, because he's out in the middle of this, and rather than shaking his fist at these kids who are not appreciating the long history of the structure and rules of science, he goes, oh wait, no, they're right. that I am here grinding the curiosity out of these young people who could be brilliant scientists of the future. I am contributing to their limited views and excluding people who otherwise would have really interesting things to say about science. So this flips him, and he kind of turns his back on what has come before, and he writes this book that makes him the enemy of science. Now, he gets pilloried for this. He gets kind of this is a slap in the face of the scientific institution. He later on, in his autobiography, he notes that He was depressed by his kind of exclusion from that. He said he wished he'd never written the fucking book, but he then doubled down and kind of tries to both clarify that he's not a relativist, that he is instead a pluralist when it comes to the epistemology of science, that he thinks that he still is going to argue that he thinks that a number of views should be present. He makes an interesting claim in his follow-up that there should be a wall between science and state, that because it has its own ideological component, that we should ensure that that there is no connection between the state and science, which obviously is not a position that has won. He makes a number of claims around sort of this question of how we can encourage a messy practice, a messy and pluralistic practice of science, that we kind of make sure that the over influence by institutions, by power and persuasion, by the business and capital, the world of capital, and by historical sort of context, that doesn't lead to a universalizing singular view of science that basically allows for very little innovation. And one of the ways we do that is by encouraging the idea that anything goes. And so that's my encouragement to you, which is it's worth learning these methods. It is true that a journal will not publish your work if it does not fit within certain expectations around methodological, I don't want to say purity, but at least rigor. But I do want to encourage you to act against method. This clearly follows along my argument before around sort of an applied scientific approach and this idea of a forensic view of what constitutes scientific inquiry and methodological approaches. And so this is not a course about the epistemology of the social sciences. It really is about the methodology. But I do want to encourage you to think about, doing something not just because that's the way it's been done, and not necessarily because that's the way that works. I want you to be flexible. I want you to engage in ad hoc theory making. I think that these are worthwhile ways of finding stuff out and figuring out what's important along the way. And so this seems like a counterintuitive thing to say after we've been looking at a bunch of methods. And again, it's more of a tour of methods that exist. And I think that there is sort of like, you're never going to be a great dancer if you just learn the steps, but learning the steps might help you to find your own dance. And so that's kind of a reason to understand and to read the methods section when you look at an article. But I do want you to make sure that you're not feeling constrained by that. I do want you to think about whether you can think about new ways of discovering stuff. I mean, so, if you want to stand in front of if you want to walk into an elevator and look the wrong way, this is nothing that anyone has adopted. As those who don't know, this is the violation of social norms is actually named after Garfinkel, who found it. So you can call this Garfinkeling. This is not something that someone thought of as a method before. It certainly doesn't follow along any existing methods really explicitly. Or if you want to walk onto a subway as Batman, these are not kinds of the sorts of things that are suggested by the literature already. And yet, and now they have been, so now you can do those kinds of things. But part of the innovation there was finding new knowledge by finding new methods. And I think that rather than just thinking about methods as a way of proving or disproving a particular set of social theories, innovating in the methods themselves can open up new avenues of knowledge in really interesting ways. So especially right now, when we are in a period of heavy flux in how we make use of observational data, in new forms of traces, in new kinds of analysis, this is the golden period for throwing bombs, for doing stuff that other people haven't thought about before in terms of methodological keys that might open up new understanding. So anything goes. Go for it.